There's a mass exodus happening that nobody's talking about. The most conscious, awake, and psychologically developed people are quietly withdrawing from society. Not angrily, not dramatically. They're just disappearing, going off-grid, leaving social media, abandoning careers, ending relationships, choosing solitude over society. Carl Jung predicted this. He called it the necessary withdrawal. When someone becomes so psychologically conscious that participating in collective unconsciousness becomes physically painful, not metaphorically painful, actually somatically, psychologically painful. Tonight I'll explain why Jung believed this disappearance isn't just inevitable for awakening people, it's essential. Why the more conscious you become, the less you can tolerate normal society. And why this isn't spiritual bypassing or escapism. It's the psyche's survival mechanism when surrounded by mass unconsciousness. If you've been feeling the pull to withdraw, to disappear, to leave it all behind, Jung would say you're not antisocial. You're becoming too conscious for the collective container. 1. The collective unconscious is a shadow factory. Society runs on shared delusions like a massive theater where everyone forgot they're acting. Walk into any office, scroll through any social platform, listen to any political debate, and you'll witness something Jung called the greatest show on earth, collective unconsciousness performing itself with complete conviction. Picture this moment. Two co-workers arguing about which department is dragging the company down. Each one absolutely certain they see the truth, completely blind to the fact they're both projecting their own feelings of inadequacy onto the other group. This isn't stupidity. It's the collective unconscious functioning exactly as designed. Jung discovered that society operates like a vast shadow projection machine. Every group, every tribe, every collective needs somewhere to put what it cannot accept about itself. The religious project their repressed sexuality onto the secular. The progressive project their hidden authoritarianism onto the conservative. The successful project their buried shame onto the struggling. Round and round it goes, this endless carnival of psychological displacement. The individual has always had to struggle not to be overwhelmed by the tribe, Jung observed. But here's what he understood, that most miss the tribe doesn't just influence you through peer pressure or social norms. It literally colonizes your psyche through shared shadow projections. You absorb not just ideas, but the collective's disowned psychological material. Consider what happened during the last major political cycle. Watch how each side described the other, evil, delusional, dangerous, threatening everything good and decent. Classic shadow projection. Each group saw in their opponents exactly what they refused to acknowledge in themselves. The peaceful side projected their own capacity for violence. The rational side projected their own susceptibility to propaganda. The moral side projected their own potential for corruption. A person who's integrated their shadow watches this theater with a mixture of compassion and horror. They see that both sides are essentially punching mirrors, fighting reflections of their own disowned darkness. Participating becomes impossible when you recognize the entire conflict as mass psychological projection. Recent research in social psychology confirms what Jung intuited decades ago. Studies on in-group bias show that groups consistently rate themselves higher on positive traits while attributing negative traits to out-groups. The projection mechanism is so automatic, so unconscious, that participants remain convinced of their objectivity even when presented with evidence of their bias. But the shadow factory doesn't just operate in obvious conflicts. It's woven into the fabric of everyday social interaction. The gossip that bonds co-workers, the shared eye rolls about those people, the collective agreements about who's acceptable and who isn't. Every community maintains its cohesion by agreeing on where to project its shadow. For someone still operating unconsciously, this feels like belonging. You're part of the group that sees clearly, surrounded by others who share your righteous perspective. There's comfort in collective projection. It creates the illusion of innocence, the feeling that darkness exists out there rather than within. Then awakening happens. You start integrating your own shadow, owning your capacity for pettiness, cruelty, self-deception. And suddenly you can't participate in the collective projection anymore. When your co-workers complain about those difficult clients, you see the difficulty you've all contributed. When your family gossips about the crazy relative, you recognize the craziness you're all avoiding in yourselves. The awakened person finds themselves in an impossible position. They can see the projections flying everywhere, but pointing them out only makes them the new target. Suggest that maybe both political sides have valid concerns, and both sides will project their shadow onto you. Try to bridge divides, and you become the enemy of division-dependent identities. This is why conscious individuals often report feeling like aliens in normal social settings. They're watching a complex psychological drama, while everyone else insists they're engaged in objective reality. It's not superiority that creates this distance, but clarity. When you've stopped projecting your shadow, you can see everyone else's projections with uncomfortable precision. The collective unconscious doesn't just create shadow projections randomly. It targets specific groups, specific individuals, specific ideas that threaten its stability. And nothing threatens collective unconsciousness more than individual consciousness. The person who won't project won't participate in shared delusions, won't agree that the problem exists. Out there becomes a walking disruption to the entire system. Jung realized that collective unconsciousness functions like an immune system attacking anything that threatens its coherence. The conscious individual becomes a foreign body that must be expelled or converted. Either you rejoin the projection game, or you face increasing isolation from the collective container. But recognizing the collective shadow is just the beginning. The real problem emerges when you can no longer participate in it, when every social interaction requires you to pretend you don't see the projections flying, when maintaining relationships means betraying your own clarity. That's when the impossible choice reveals itself. Consciousness or belonging. And for the awakening person, that choice has already been made. 2. The persona performance becomes impossible. What happens when you've found your authentic self, but the world only accepts your mask? This is the cruel paradox every awakening person faces. You spend years, maybe decades, crafting the perfect persona. The successful professional, the agreeable friend, the dependable family member. Then consciousness breaks through, and suddenly that carefully constructed identity feels like a straitjacket designed by someone you used to be. Jung understood this agony intimately. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. He wrote, but he knew the price of that privilege. Once you touch your authentic self, that deeper truth beneath all the social masks returning to persona performance doesn't feel like acting anymore. It feels like psychological suicide. Think about a successful executive who spent 20 years perfecting her boardroom persona. Sharp suits, confident handshakes, the right opinions delivered with the right tone. Then awakening happens. Maybe through crisis, maybe through gradual realization, but suddenly she sees through her own performance. She recognizes the persona as a construction, a tool that served its purpose but no longer fits who she's becoming. The first few meetings after this realization are torture. Every strategic smile feels false. Every politically correct response tastes like ash. She sits in familiar conference rooms, surrounded by familiar faces speaking familiar words, but now she can feel the persona like a mask that's grown too small. It pinches. It restricts her breathing. It demands she betray everything she's discovered about herself. I remember sitting in meetings like that, feeling suffocated from the inside. Everyone around the table was saying things nobody actually believed, performing their professional roles with such conviction that I wondered if I was the only one who could see the elaborate theater we'd all agreed to maintain. The cognitive dissonance became physically painful. The awakening person discovers that personas aren't just social tools. They're energy systems that require constant maintenance. Before consciousness, this maintenance happened automatically. You unconsciously adjusted your personality to match your environment. Different persona for work, for family, for friends. It felt natural because you identified with these roles. But once you've experienced your authentic self, persona maintenance becomes manual labor. Every interaction requires conscious effort to suppress your real responses and generate appropriate ones. You find yourself rehearsing conversations, calculating the right level of enthusiasm, modulating your truth to fit social expectations. It's exhausting in ways that unconscious people never experience. The executive starts noticing how much energy goes into maintaining her professional mask. The forced networking conversations that once felt strategic now drain her completely. The motivational emails she sends to her team feel like lies. The quarterly presentations become elaborate performances of someone she no longer is. She's not just acting a role, she's betraying a truth she can no longer unsee. Friends and family begin to sense the shift. "You seem different lately," they say with concern that carries an undertone of accusation. They're right, of course. The person they knew was largely persona, and that persona is dying. But they don't want growth, they want consistency. They want the predictable version of you back, the one who played the roles they needed you to play. This creates an impossible bind. Maintain the personas and betray your authentic self. Drop the masks and lose the relationships built around them. Most people aren't ready for your authenticity. They're attached to your performance. They need you to keep playing the character they've learned to interact with. The executive realizes that her entire career was built around a persona that no longer exists. Her leadership style, her professional relationships, her industry reputation, all constructed around someone she's outgrown. She can't simply modify the persona slightly. The awakening has been too complete, the gap between mask and reality too vast. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. Patients who successfully individuated often couldn't return to their previous lives. The personas that once felt natural now felt like elaborate costumes for plays they no longer wanted to perform. Some tried to force it to squeeze their expanded consciousness back into familiar roles. The result was always the same depression anxiety, a sense of living in exile from themselves. The persona death isn't just personal, it's social. Your old identity served functions in other people's lives. The reliable friend, the family peacekeeper, the office problem solver. When you can no longer perform these roles authentically, you're not just changing yourself. You're disrupting systems that depend on your persona to maintain their equilibrium. This is why many awakening people report feeling like they're disappointing everyone. Their families want the old dynamics. Their employers want the familiar performance. Their friends want the predictable personality they learned to count on. But the awakened person can no longer deliver these things without feeling like they're betraying something sacred within themselves. The most painful realization is that many relationships were built around persona compatibility, not authentic connection. When you stop performing your familiar role, you discover which relationships can survive your authenticity and which ones were always dependent on your masks. The loss can be devastating, but the alternative, living in permanent disguise, becomes impossible. This persona death creates an energy crisis that most awakened people don't see coming. Suddenly, they're experiencing a kind of social friction they've never felt before, an exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from the impossible effort of pretending to be someone they've outgrown. 3. The energetic incompatibility. Consciousness isn't just awareness, it's a frequency that becomes allergic to unconsciousness. When you awaken, you don't just think differently. Your entire nervous system recalibrates to a new energetic baseline, and suddenly environments that once felt normal become as jarring as fingernails on a chalkboard. Jung observed this phenomenon repeatedly. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. But he was describing more than social dynamics. He was pointing to something literally physiological, the way conscious and unconscious energies create friction when they collide. Imagine a tuning fork calibrated to a specific frequency, then placed in a room full of discordant noise. The fork doesn't just hear the chaos, it resonates with, it vibrates against it, experiences it as physical disruption. This is what happens to the awakened person in unconscious environments. They're not just observing the collective shadow projections and persona performances, they're absorbing them. Consider Sarah, a high school teacher who spent 3 years in intensive therapy, working through childhood trauma and developing genuine self-awareness. The process was transformative. She integrated her shadow, dropped her people-pleasing persona, and found a sense of inner peace she'd never known. Then she returned to her classroom. Within weeks, she was exhausted in ways she couldn't explain. Not the familiar tiredness of lesson planning and grading papers, but something deeper, a bone-deep fatigue that sleep couldn't touch. Her doctor ran every test imaginable. Bloodwork, thyroid, autoimmune panels. Everything came back normal. Physically, she was healthy. Energetically, she was being drained dry. What Sarah didn't realize was that consciousness requires tremendous psychological labor to maintain in unconscious environments. Every interaction with unconscious colleagues demanded that she not react to their projections. Every faculty meeting required her to hold her center while others vented their unprocessed emotions. Every day in the classroom meant maintaining boundaries against the collective unconsciousness of hundreds of teenagers. Modern neuroscience is beginning to understand what Jung intuited. Research on highly sensitive persons shows that certain individuals process sensory information more deeply, their nervous systems more reactive to environmental stimuli. Studies on mirror neurons reveal how we unconsciously absorb and reflect the emotional states of those around us. Emotional contagion research demonstrates that feelings literally spread through groups like viruses. For someone still operating unconsciously, this absorption happens automatically and unconsciously. They match the emotional frequency of their environment without effort or awareness. But conscious individuals can't merge with collective unconsciousness anymore. Instead, they must actively resist it, constantly filtering and processing the unconscious material they encounter. Think about what the awakened person experiences in a typical day. The coworker who dumps their emotional baggage during casual conversation. The social media scroll filled with outrage and projection. The family dinner where everyone rehashes the same unconscious patterns. Each interaction requires them to maintain their center while surrounded by people operating from their wounds. This isn't about being superior or separate. It's about energetic compatibility. The conscious person has developed a different operating system, one that can't run the old programs without significant effort and strain. Every unconscious environment becomes a source of resistance, like trying to swim upstream in a river of collective reactivity. Sarah discovered this when she finally took a sabbatical and rented a cabin in the mountains. Within 2 weeks, her mysterious fatigue began lifting. Her energy returned not because she was resting, but because she was no longer expending massive amounts of psychological energy, maintaining consciousness in an unconscious environment. The awakened person realizes they're doing invisible work that others don't even recognize exists. They're processing not just their own emotions, but filtering out the projections constantly directed at them. They're maintaining their authentic responses while navigating social situations that reward performance. They're holding space for truth while surrounded by people invested in comfortable delusions. Jung called this the burden of consciousness. The awakened individual becomes a kind of emotional shock absorber for the collective processing unconscious material that others can't or won't face. They feel the pain beneath others' anger, the fear beneath their certainty, the emptiness beneath their performance. It's a form of involuntary service that can be devastating to someone unprepared for it. The energy drain isn't just from what the conscious person encounters, it's from what they must constantly resist becoming. Every unconscious environment pressures them to match its frequency, to abandon their clarity and join the collective trance. The psychological effort required to maintain consciousness while surrounded by unconsciousness is like trying to stay awake in a room full of people using sleeping gas. Research on emotional regulation shows that conscious emotion processing requires significant mental resources. When you multiply this by the constant stream of unconscious material the awakened person encounters, the energetic cost becomes enormous. They're not just managing their own emotional landscape, they're navigating everyone else's unprocessed material. This creates a feedback loop of exhaustion. The more tired the conscious person becomes, the harder it is to maintain boundaries against unconscious energies. The more they absorb from their environment, the more depleted they feel. Eventually, something has to give. This energetic crisis forces the psyche into survival mode, and survival means withdrawal. The awakened person begins to instinctively avoid situations and relationships that drain their consciousness, not from judgment or superiority, but from the simple recognition that their inner light requires different conditions to burn brightly. Archetypal hermit emerges. What society sees as abandonment, Jung saw as archetypal necessity. When the awakened person begins to withdraw from social obligations, career demands, and relationship expectations, the collective interprets this as failure depression or antisocial behavior. But Jung recognized something deeper at work: the emergence of the archetypal hermit, a developmental phase as natural and necessary as the caterpillar's dissolution in the cocoon. The hermit isn't running away from life, they're diving deeper into it than society allows. Like the butterfly that must completely dissolve its caterpillar form before transformation can occur, consciousness requires periods of solitude to integrate what collective life would fragment. This withdrawal isn't pathology, it's metamorphosis. Loneliness does not come from having no people about one, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to oneself. Jung wrote from his own experience. After his break with Freud and his confrontation with the unconscious, Jung found himself increasingly unable to participate in the social and professional circles that had once defined his identity. Not from bitterness or misanthropy, but from the simple recognition that his inner landscape had become foreign territory to most people around him. Jung's retreat to Bollingen reveals the hermit archetype in action. This wasn't a vacation home or escape from responsibility. It was a sanctuary where his expanding consciousness could exist without compromise. He built his tower stone by stone with his own hands, each rock placed as a meditation, a ritual of creating space for the self that was emerging from his depths. The building itself became a metaphor for individuation. No architects, no modern conveniences, no social expectations about what a successful psychiatrist's retreat should look like. Just a man and stone and the slow, meditative work of creating container for consciousness that couldn't fit in the conventional world. The tower wasn't built to impress others. It was built to house the parts of himself that had no place in Zurich society. In tarot symbolism, the hermit card depicts a figure holding a lantern, standing alone on a mountain peak. This isn't the image of someone lost in darkness, but someone who has become a bearer of inner light. The hermit withdraws not to avoid illumination, but to preserve it, to tend the flame that might be extinguished by the winds of collective unconsciousness. The awakening person discovers that their consciousness requires different conditions than they once needed. Like a plant that has outgrown its pot, they need space to expand that social containers can't provide. The hermit phase allows for integration without interference, growth without compromise, truth without translation. There are days when I feel like I'm speaking a language nobody understands. Not because others aren't intelligent or capable, but because we're operating from different dimensions of experience. They're discussing surface currents while I'm feeling the deep ocean movements beneath. It's not superiority, it's incompatibility. we've developed different sensory organs for reality. This hermit emergence follows predictable patterns. First comes the recognition that social interaction requires too much energy to sustain. Then the gradual reduction of commitments, the polite excuses that become increasingly honest. Finally, the active creation of solitude, not empty isolation, but rich, conscious withdrawal, where inner work can unfold without distraction. The hermit discovers that solitude isn't loneliness, it's reunion with the self. In silence, they can hear the voice that gets drowned out by social noise. In stillness, they can feel the movements of their own psyche without the interference of others' projections. In withdrawal, they can finally stop translating their truth into socially acceptable terms and experience it directly. Society pathologizes this withdrawal because it threatens the collective's stability. The hermit's contentment in solitude implies that social connection isn't the ultimate human need. Their peace in simplicity suggests that material success isn't the only path to fulfillment. Their authenticity in isolation reveals the performance required for social acceptance. But the hermit phase isn't permanent exile, it's psychological gestation. Like pregnancy, it requires protection from outside interference to allow new life to form. The consciousness that's developing needs time and space to solidify before it can engage with the world from its new foundation. Jung understood that this archetypal pattern serves evolution itself. The hermit doesn't withdraw from humanity. They withdraw for humanity, developing capacities and insights that the collective isn't ready for yet, but will eventually need. They're not abandoning their tribe. They're scouting territories of consciousness that the group will someday require for survival. The hermit phase teaches crucial lessons that can only be learned in solitude. How to distinguish between your authentic voice and the chorus of social expectations. How to find fulfillment in being rather than doing. How to maintain inner equilibrium without external validation. These aren't selfish pursuits, they're preparations for a different kind of service to the collective. But here's what society doesn't understand about this disappearance. The hermit isn't gone forever. They're gestating something that will eventually benefit the very social matrix they've temporarily abandoned. The withdrawal is creating capacity for a different kind of engagement, one that serves consciousness rather than conformity. 5. The return as border dwellers. The awakened don't stay gone forever. They return, but never to the mainstream. After the hermit phase completes its work of integration and transformation, consciousness calls the individual back into engagement with the world. But this return follows a different pattern than society expects. They don't rejoin the collective unconsciousness they left behind. Instead, they become what Jung might call border dwellers present, but not participating, visible, but not absorbed. Think of deep-sea divers who have adapted to breathing underwater. They can visit the surface, interact with surface dwellers, even provide valuable services. But they can't live there anymore. The pressure is wrong, the atmosphere insufficient for the beings they've become. So they create underwater cities, alternative structures, where others who've learned to breathe in depth can find refuge and community. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Jung wrote, The returning conscious individual brings this darkness made conscious back with them. But the mainstream world isn't ready for such unfiltered truth. So they find or create spaces on the edges, the margins, the borderlands between conscious and unconscious society. Consider Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a clinical psychologist, who disappeared from her successful private practice after a profound spiritual awakening. For 2 years, she worked as a park ranger, spending her days in nature integrating insights that would have seemed impossible to her former colleagues. When she finally returned to therapeutic work, she didn't reopen her general practice. Instead, she began working exclusively with people experiencing what she called spiritual emergencies, individuals whose awakening process was being pathologized by mainstream mental health. Her practice became tiny by conventional standards. Maybe 20 clients at a time, all referrals from others who'd walked similar paths. No insurance accepted, no professional networking events, no attempts to scale or systematize. But the impact was profound in ways that numbers couldn't measure. She became a lifeline for people whose consciousness was expanding beyond what traditional therapy could support. This pattern repeats throughout history. The mystics never returned to orthodox religion. They created contemplative communities on its edges. The revolutionary artists didn't rejoin academic institutions. They founded alternative movements that eventually influenced the center. The philosophical pioneers didn't integrate back into university departments. They wrote from exile, creating ideas that would transform mainstream thought decades later. The border dweller operates from a different economic and social model than mainstream society. They're not trying to capture market share or build empires. They're responding to calls that most people can't hear, serving needs that don't show up in conventional surveys. Their success is measured in depth rather than breadth, in transformation rather than transaction. These returning individuals often find each other through invisible networks. The therapist who works with spiritual emergence connects with the artist creating visionary work, who knows the entrepreneur building a conscious business, who's friends with the teacher developing alternative education. They form a parallel economy of consciousness, supporting each other's work while remaining largely invisible to mainstream society. The border dweller has learned to live in multiple worlds simultaneously. They can engage with unconscious systems when necessary, paying taxes, obtaining permits, navigating bureaucracies. But they don't invest their identity in these interactions. They maintain their center while moving through surface structures like ambassadors from a country that doesn't yet exist on any map. What distinguishes the border dweller from the hermit is their willingness to serve as bridges. They can translate between dimensions of experience, helping others who are beginning their own awakening process. They become what Jung called wounded healers, individuals whose own integration of darkness makes them capable of holding space for others' shadow work. But they can't do this work within mainstream structures. The conscious therapist can't operate within systems that pathologize spiritual experience. The awakened teacher can't function in educational institutions designed to produce conformity. The individuated leader can't thrive in corporate environments that reward persona performance over authentic contribution. So they create alternatives, small practices, alternative schools, conscious businesses, intentional communities. These structures operate by different principles than mainstream institutions. They prioritize depth over efficiency, meaning over profit, authenticity over acceptability. They're not trying to compete with existing systems. They're modeling different possibilities. The border dweller understands that their role isn't to convert the mainstream, but to provide alternatives for those ready to explore different ways of being. They're not missionaries trying to save the unconscious world. They're gardeners tending seeds of possibility that will sprout when conditions are right. This creates a paradox that explains everything about why the awakened seem to be disappearing from society while simultaneously preparing something essential for its future evolution. 6. The evolutionary necessity. What looks like abandonment is actually architecture for collective evolution. The mass exodus of awakened individuals isn't a retreat from society. It's the advanced scouting party for humanity's next developmental stage. Like the scouts of ancient tribes who ventured beyond familiar territory to find new hunting grounds and safe passages, the spiritually awakened are mapping territories of consciousness that the collective will eventually need to survive. Jung understood this evolutionary pattern. The creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect, but by the play instinct acting from inner necessity. The awakened aren't making strategic decisions to abandon society. They're following an inner compulsion, a developmental necessity that serves purposes larger than their individual lives. Consider how evolution actually works. The pioneers always appear anomalous at first. The first amphibians leaving the ocean seemed like evolutionary mistakes until changing conditions made their adaptations essential for survival. The early mammals looked insignificant compared to the dominant reptiles until environmental shifts revealed their advantages. What appears as deviation often becomes the template for the next stage of development. The awakened individuals creating conscious communities. Intentional businesses and alternative relationship structures aren't just pursuing personal preferences. They're prototyping new social forms that address problems mainstream society hasn't even recognized yet. They're experiments in authentic communication, sustainable economics, and integrated shadow work are creating blueprints for collective structures that may become necessary as humanity faces increasing complexity. Watch what's emerging on the margins. Conscious communities that prioritize psychological development alongside material sustainability. Businesses organized around purpose rather than profit maximization, where employees are seen as whole human beings rather than productivity units. Educational approaches that honor individual authenticity rather than forcing conformity to standardized metrics. Therapeutic modalities that integrate spiritual dimensions rather than pathologizing transcendent experiences. These aren't utopian fantasies, they're working experiments. The conscious community in Costa Rica, where decision-making happens through deep listening rather than majority rule. The tech company in Portland, where meetings begin with moments of silent reflection and emotional check-ins. The school in Vermont, where children learn to identify and process their emotions as rigorously as they learn mathematics. Each experiment appears small, even insignificant, measured against mainstream institutions. But they're developing operational models for different ways of organizing human cooperation. They're discovering what becomes possible when shadow projection is minimized, when persona performance isn't required, when individual authenticity is valued over collective conformity. The evolutionary function becomes clear when you recognize the crises mainstream society faces. Environmental collapse driven by unconscious consumption. Political polarization fueled by mass shadow projection. Mental health epidemics rooted in disconnection from authentic self. Economic systems that create abundance and emptiness simultaneously. These aren't problems that can be solved within the same consciousness that created them. The awakened individuals who seem to be abandoning society are actually developing the psychological and social technologies that could address these systemic crises. Their work on individual shadow integration reduces the projection that fuels collective conflicts. Their experiments in authentic relationship create models for genuine connection. Their conscious business practices demonstrate alternatives to extractive economics. But this evolutionary function requires them to work from the margins. Mainstream institutions are too invested in existing structures to experiment with fundamental alternatives. The awakened must create parallel systems, demonstrate different possibilities, develop proof of concept for consciousness-based organization. They're not trying to reform existing systems, they're modeling their replacement. Jung recognized that individual consciousness serves collective evolution. Each person who successfully individuates, who integrates their shadow and drops their persona, makes it easier for others to do the same. They're not just personal achievements, they're contributions to the collective unconscious, expanding the range of what humans recognize as possible. The disappearing awakened are performing invisible service. They're holding space for capacities that the collective isn't ready to acknowledge. They're developing emotional and spiritual technologies that will become essential as humanity faces increasing complexity. They're pioneering territories of consciousness that may provide refuge when current systems reach their limits. This isn't wishful thinking, it's pattern recognition. Throughout history, the mystics, artists, and visionaries who seemed to abandon their societies were actually preparing gifts that those societies would later desperately need. The contemplatives who preserved wisdom through dark ages, the artists who imagined new possibilities during cultural transitions, the philosophers who developed frameworks for emerging realities. Perhaps you're feeling that pull too, the sense that you're being called toward something that doesn't yet exist, but that you must help create. That familiar restlessness when surrounded by unconscious systems, the growing clarity that your authentic contribution requires different containers than society currently provides. The awakened aren't abandoning ship, they're building lifeboats. Not from apocalyptic thinking, but from evolutionary necessity. They're following an inner compass that points toward possibilities the collective consciousness can't yet imagine. Their disappearance from mainstream society is actually their emergence as architects of its potential future. The scouts have always left the tribe to explore unknown territory. Their absence creates temporary inconvenience, but opens pathways to survival. The spiritually awakened are following this ancient pattern, disappearing from familiar structures to map the consciousness territories that humanity may need to inhabit as the current ones become uninhabitable. The spiritually awake aren't abandoning society, they're gestating its future. Their withdrawal isn't escape, but evolutionary necessity creating the consciousness structures that collective survival may eventually require. Jung knew this truth. What you can no longer tolerate is calling you to transcend. If this resonates in the depths where your truest knowing lives, write this in the comments. I choose conscious withdrawal over unconscious participation. Let these words be your permission, your recognition that your disappearance isn't failure, it's pioneering. The hermit's lantern burns not to illuminate the path behind, but to light territories that don't yet exist on any map. Your withdrawal is creating something the world can't see yet, but will need. In our next exploration, we'll dive deeper into how to navigate this withdrawal without losing your heart. How to become a bridge between worlds rather than a refugee from one. The journey toward authentic solitude is just beginning. Your disappearance isn't abandonment, it's architecture. The future needs you awake more than the present needs you asleep.